joining us for this webinar as part of the Redevelopment Expert Exchange webinar series. My name is Carrie Staten. I'm the Associate Director of the Northern West Virginia Brownfields Assistance Center. I manage the webinar series, and I'm just going to do a couple quick slides on this Redevelopment Expert Exchange program, a couple of housekeeping issues related to how we're going to field questions today, and then I will hand it over to our speakers from the Historic Preservation Office. The Redevelopment Expert Exchange is a program of the Brownfields Assistance Center at WVU. We created this program to encourage experience sharing between West Virginia communities. So we saw that a lot of you folks who are working in your communities are doing some really great stuff, and a lot of times you don't get to hear about the stuff that other people are doing unless you're going to a conference once a year, and you may have questions come up as you're working on your projects that other people have already dealt with and may have a creative solution to. So we wanted to create a way for folks to interact more organically and more frequently with one another across the state. And so we set up the Redevelopment Expert Exchange to do that through two opportunities. The first, not on your slide, but the first is the webinars, which is what we're doing today. So these are monthly. They're focused on special topics related to redevelopment. These can range anywhere from redevelopment of a trail or a train depot to issues related to abandoned and dilapidated buildings or historic properties that we're going to talk about today. So those happen monthly. And then we have our peer-to-peer exchanges, which are site visits mostly, where if you wanted to learn about something that's happening in another part of the state, a project that's similar to yours but maybe is further along, we have travel funding available to help you travel to that community and to learn from each other. So what happens is we get those requests in our office, and then I work with you to identify somebody either that you're already aware of that you could learn from, or that maybe our network is aware of, and then handle the logistics and fund your transportation costs to get to that community or to bring them to you to talk about your similar projects and to learn from one another. We've also done the same kind of thing through workshops or consultations in coordination with broader events. So perhaps at our state conference, if we know there's a couple of communities coming who could learn well from each other, we would provide the space for you to have that one-on-one exchange and conversation to learn from one another in that setting as well. So you can request an exchange at any time by visiting our website, which is listed on your screen, and these slides will be available for you afterwards on our website, and also a recording of the presentation will be available, so you'll be able to get back to this stuff later. So don't feel like you have to jot that down real quick, but you can request an exchange, offer to host an exchange, or you can even suggest a webinar topic at that website. I'm always looking for webinar ideas, so if there's something that you want to learn about or something you'd like to teach people about, please do not hesitate to reach out to me and let me know what that might be. I do have scholarships available right now. Like I said, that's for this Redevelopment Expert Exchange experience sharing and these site visits. It gets you out of your community and into another community to get inspired and learn more about what's going on across the state. It can cover travel expenses for a small group. I do have two sets of money, so that I have money available only for West Virginians, but I also have some money available for folks throughout the region of Appalachia. So I think we may have a couple of folks who are not in West Virginia who are joining us today, and I do have opportunities available. My current round of funding deadline is going to be June 30th, so you can, I'm going to send out an email blast with more details on that, and I'll include this list in that blast so that you'll have all the information you need on how to request one, what the parameters are, that kind of thing, and you can always contact me. That's my contact information there, and I'd be happy to chat with you about possible ideas or what you're thinking to see if it's a good fit. My last little bit about the Brownfield Center is we are currently planning our 12th West Virginia Brownfields Conference and our 2nd Central Appalachian Regional Brownfields Summit. Those are going to be held in conjunction on September 12th through the 14th in Morgantown. We'll be at the Erickson Alumni Center. We have some really great pre-conference mobile workshops set up. We're hoping to have a couple of grant writing trainings and some other opportunities for learning and networking on the 12th. We'll kick off our first full day of training on September 13th with a focus on West Virginia, including our West Virginia Brownfield Awards. And nominations for those awards will be open early next week. And then we'll focus on the topics that apply and are relevant to the broader region of Central Appalachia for the day on September 14th. Registration has not launched yet, but you can find more information on that event at the Brownfield's website, and registration will be live in the next week or so. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our speakers from the Historic Preservation Office. We do have a couple of quick housekeeping things. They will be taking questions as you think of them. So you're all on mute now, and we're going to stay on mute just because there's a lot of us, and it's easier that way. So you can ask questions by either typing them into the questions box or in the chat box. I will be monitoring both of those as we go, and as your questions pop up, I will interject and ask our speakers to answer them for you, and then they'll also take any questions you have remaining at the end. All right. So with that, I'm going to just switch over to Jennifer.
Okay, well, thank you. My name is Jennifer Brennan. I am the tax credit coordinator for the State Historic Preservation Office. We also have Ben Riggle.
I'm a Section 106 reviewer for the Preservation Office here.
So what the goal for what we're going to do today is to offer a little bit of background into our office, how our office works, and kind of some of the programs that we have available to you as you're working with historic structures. The first thing we want to make sure everybody understands is our office. When I think of our office, I think of it as kind of a building block and foundations. And the main foundation for our office is the National Register of Historic Places. The National Register is administered by the National Park Service. We are a partner on several programs with the National Park Service. It is a nationwide program. You can see on the screen, just in West Virginia alone, we have approximately 25,000 properties listed in the National Register. That number is actually a little bit low. We're probably closer to about 27,000 to 30,000 at this point. But nationally, over 1.5 million properties are listed. Those numbers are a little bit old, so we're definitely higher than that. And we work in consultation with the National Park Service on the National Register. Now, if you are looking to be listed in the National Register, or if you think you're in a community, you can be listed in several ways. You can be listed either individually, which means that your property has a high level of significance and can kind of stand on its own. You can also be listed as part of a district, which the majority of properties are actually listed as part of a district. You might be familiar with the East End Historic District here in Charleston, the Fairmont Historic District. Lewisburg has a historic district, and actually the entire town of Shepherdstown is a historic district. So the majority of properties are listed as part of a district. And then we also have something called a multiple property submission, which is more unusual, and we don't see a whole lot, but the reasoning behind that is there is some kind of common history with those buildings. So you could think in terms of the state parks that we have. Charleston has a multiple property listing in the South Hills neighborhood, things along that line, but they are a little bit more unusual than a district. In order to be listed in the National Register, a property or a structure does have to be at least 50 years old, typically. It must retain integrity, and it must be significant for some reason. Now, we do have properties that are listed prior to their 50-year age. On the screen, you see the New River Gorge Bridge. That was actually listed when it was about 37 years old. And that was listed because it has a high level of significance for the state and the country. So it has to, if you're not 50 years old, the structure does have to have a higher level of significance. And there is a lot of confusion about what integrity means and what that entails. So when we're talking about integrity, these are the 7 aspects that we're looking at: the location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. And we'll get into these a little bit more later on when we're talking about Section 106. So there's a lot of confusion about what the National Register does and what it allows you to do as a property owner. Basically, the National Register is an honorary listing that opens you up to financial incentives. That's pretty much all it does. It offers limited protection in Section 106, which Ben will be talking about in a second. And it just allows you to honor the significance of your property. The National Register does not restrict use. We don't restrict the sale. We don't require maintenance and upkeep on a building, but it also doesn't guarantee that we have funds available to help you with that. So we do have some grant funds available, which we'll talk about later, but we unfortunately cannot guarantee that just because your property is listed, you will receive funding. So I'm going to turn it over to Ben, and he's going to talk a little bit about Section 106 and that whole process of working within the 106 world.
That's the Section 106 law up on the screen right now. It's pretty dense, but basically the summary of it is any project requiring federal funds and or permits triggers the Section 106 process, which means basically the federal agency in charge of the project has to ensure a reasonable opportunity to comment and assess the effects of the property or of the project on potentially historic eligible property. There are 4 steps in the Section 106 process. The first is the initiation of the review process, because you have to determine that there is a need for review. Then the next step, if you determine that there is a need for review, is identification of the historic property. So you have to identify what resources are out there. And once you identify the resource, you assess the effects. So you determine how the project is going to affect those resources. And if there are going to be adverse effects, then you go to the resolution of adverse effects. Here's some basic things to keep in mind, that it's the obligation of the federal agency to fulfill the requirements of the 106 process. So they're technically responsible for it. And then we have 30 days to respond to any of the undertakings to make sure that we get our responses back. Some basic definitions for you. Historic property means any prehistoric or historic district, site, building, structure, or object included on or eligible for inclusion in the National Register. This can include artifacts, records, and material remains related to the object, the district, the site, and the building. An undertaking, the term undertaking is a project, activity, or program funded in whole or in part under the direct or indirect jurisdiction of a federal agency. This will include those carried out on behalf of the federal agency, those carried out with federal financial assistance, anything requiring a federal permit, licensing, or approval, and those subject to state or local regulations pursuant to or approval by this federal agency. The initial step, the first one, is to determine if you have an undertaking. Once you determine if your project is federally funded or permitted, if it is yes, then you go down and does it have a potential to affect the resources. If the answer is yes to both of them, then you'll need to identify any consulting parties. So the State Preservation Office is obviously going to be a consulting party, and then any local historic resource commissions, anything like that. The public can become involved. Anybody with a view of the project area could be a consulting party. And then we move on to once we identify that, we'll move on to the identification portion. To do this, you develop an APE, which is the area of potential effect. That's how you know where your project is going to impact. Once you determine that, then you can you need to carry out the reasonable and good faith effort to identify the National Register listed resource or eligible resources. The area of potential effect, as an example here with the map, shows the geographic area where the project could directly or indirectly impact. So that would be both, either like direct impacts could be something like you're going to actually have to take off an addition to a building or change the building's roof, something like that. Or indirect can be the view shed, like you want to put a cell phone tower up or put solar panels onto a roof in a historic district. You have to take into consideration what the view shed will be. These are the types of historic properties that could be historic properties. We got buildings, which are your typical houses and barns. Sites can be battlefields, trails, remains of prehistoric villages, that kind of stuff. Structures are your engineering type design, so bridges, dams, canals. Then objects are something like sculptures, fountains, mile markers that add to the character of a setting, but you can't live inside them, basically. And then the districts are obviously the concentration of either residential, rural areas, anything that has related type resources can be a district. So now, to be eligible for the National Historic District, as we covered a little bit in the summary part, generally you have to be, the resource has to be at least 50 years of age. There are 4 criteria of evaluation, which I'll discuss next, and then the 7 aspects of integrity. In addition to the 4 criteria, there are also 7 criteria consideration, which can come into play. For instance, if the building is, or the structure is less than 50 years of age, there's a criteria consideration for that. Then a resource can be significant on a local, state, regional, or on a national level. So you have to take all those into account when you evaluate your resource. Right. To be eligible for the first criteria for significance is Criterion A, which means the property is associated with the events that made a significant contribution to the broad patterns of our history. So for instance, like the railroad bridge in the Thurmont Historic District, the railroad was significant to the rail transportation, so therefore the transportation is important to our pattern of development. So it's eligible under Criterion A. Criterion B gains a significance from being associated with the lives of a significant person. The example here, Thurnberg, he was involved in the Civil War, and this is his house that he built over in Barboursville. Criterion C is the architecture criterion or engineering. So it possesses the distinctive characteristics of a type, period, method of construction, or represents the work of a master, or it has high artistic value. So for instance, the Wheeling Suspension Bridge, it has distinctive characteristics of a stone arch suspension bridge, so it's eligible under criteria C. Criterion D is I tend to refer to as the archaeology criteria. It means the site has a likelihood of providing information. So for example, the Grave Creek Mound, by excavating, you can gain information that we might have lost if it was bulldozed. Then for integrity, I'll go through these pretty quick. We got location, pretty obvious, is the building structure located where it was constructed or hasn't been moved. Aspect of the design, so is the building remaining the same design characteristics, or has so many alterations been committed to it that you can no longer identify the original design. The setting is the area around the resource, so if it was built in a wooded area, is it still a wooded area? If it was built in an urban town, is the urban town still around it? Materials, that's pretty self-explanatory. If you have all your original clapboard siding taken off and vinyl siding put on, that impacts the integrity of the materials. Workmanship is more of like, it's similar to materials, but like if you changed out the windows, you might lose that sense of the hand-hewn wood window frames, that kind of stuff. Feeling is more of a sense that you get from the resource. Does it still provide you the feeling of a historic area? And then association, so for instance, Harper's Ferry, because of its association with the military and whatnot, it retains that integrity. Then on to step 2.
Real quick, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Before you go to the next step, we did get a question.
Okay.
If a building has a cornerstone, like from the Masons in the early 1900s, what is the procedure to protect those if the building is sold to a private developer?
Unfortunately, if it's sold to a private entity, there is no level of protection. If that developer uses any kind of federal or state funds to do work on the property, that's when that level of protection kicks in. But being listed on the National Register in and of itself does not provide a level of protection.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you're able to put easements.
You can if there is a protective easement or covenant, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, through our office. That's one level of protection, but otherwise that would be the only way to protect the building.
That's the only question we have right now.
Okay. Thanks.
Yep. Okay, on to the next. Okay. These are the outcomes of step 2. So you identified the historic properties, and now you're submitting your Section 106 review. So if there are no historic properties, there's nothing eligible for the National Register, there's nothing listed in the National Register in your area of potential effect, and our office concurs, that means the Section 106 process is finished. We provide you a letter that says we're satisfied with and nothing's going to be impacted. If there are historic properties located in the APE, but the project will either have no effect on them or it won't have an adverse effect to them, and our office concurs, then the process is also finished, and we can provide you a letter with that as well. Now, if there are historic properties are located in the APE, and we've determined that the project will adversely affect the project, and our office concurs, then we move on to step 3 of the Section 106 process, which is the assessment effects. This is how we determine what the project is going to actually do to the resource. So we have to determine if it's going to directly affect or indirectly affect, and then what it's going to affect, if it's going to affect its location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, or association. Once we have that, then we move on to resolution of adverse effects. So if we've determined that there's an adverse effect and the project can't, that it has to go on, then we ask that we try to figure out plans to avoid, minimize, or mitigate those adverse effects. So obviously the best would be to avoid the adverse effect. If the project has to go on and we can't avoid any impact, then we'd like to minimize the impact. So for instance, if you could use like a material that can be easily removed because you need, like for a wheelchair ramp, you use wood instead of concrete, it's easier to remove and reverse that process, so it minimizes the potential for adverse effect. If all else fails, we go to mitigation, which is where we develop a plan to basically mitigate any adverse effects. So that could be developing like a historic interpretation sign, museum display. There's a wide variety of mitigation strategies, and it seems like people come up with new ones every day. So we work with you guys on that. So if there is an adverse effect, don't panic. We can help you with it. And then once the agency, once the federal agency in charge in our office, as well as any other, if there's a tribal historic preservation officer involved, agree that how the adverse effects will be resolved, we develop a memorandum of agreement, which is basically a legal document detailing how the adverse effect will be mitigated. And then the memorandum of agreement result from the findings of an adverse effect. They're used to mitigate the unavoidable damage caused by a proposed project. They detail the mitigation plans so that everybody understands what the mitigation will be. And then the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation has to be invited to participate in that mitigation process as well. And turn it back over to Jennifer for the next phase.
So I thought of one other aspect of that question that was asked earlier. Just to follow up, so being listed on the National Register, as we said, does not offer any level of protection in and of itself. However, if you live in a community that has a local landmark commission, such as we have probably about 15 throughout the state that have design review, those landmark commissions can offer a level of protection in terms of demolition and incompatible changes. So depending on the community that you're in, that might be one way to protect a historic structure, but the National Register unfortunately does not. So what I wanted to talk about are the financial incentives that are available for property owners who have historic buildings. And we have several here in West Virginia. We're very fortunate that we do have several funding mechanisms available to help historic property owners. The first one that I'm going to talk about is the residential rehab tax credit. This was a program that was established in the late 90s by the state legislature. It is managed by the State Historic Preservation Office, and we partner with the Department of Revenue as we work through this program. So if you're working on a residential tax credit, basically you're either going to be talking to our office or the Department of Revenue. Now, if you have a private residential property that you wanted to do some work on, the state of West Virginia offers a 20% state tax credit on your qualified rehabilitation expenses, and I'll explain what those are in just a minute. Unfortunately, right now, it is only a state-level tax credit. We do not have a federal tax credit for residential properties. In order to be eligible to take advantage of the residential tax credit, it does have to be a private residential property. It does have to be listed in the National Register, and you have to follow the Secretary of the Interior standards. There's also a financial requirement, which is it's dependent on the value of your property. An important thing to keep in mind for the residential tax credit, outbuildings can be included. So a lot of times in the eastern panhandle of the state, we have barns, kitchen houses, some older structures that are related to the main house. Those can also take advantage of the tax credit. Here in the Charleston East End, we have a lot of carriage houses converted into garages. Those would all be eligible to receive tax credits as well. As I mentioned, you do have to be listed in the National Register, either individually or as part of a district. And it's important to keep in mind that there are districts located throughout the state. I've heard a lot of people say that tax credits only benefit the people who are living in the cities, and that's just not true. We have a lot of projects going on in places like Thomas is really taking advantage of the program. We do have some here in Charleston, but the majority of them are actually taking place in some of the smaller towns, including Ronceverte and, as I mentioned, Thomas. Now, I mentioned a financial aspect. You do have to spend 20% of the assessed value of the building in order to take advantage of this. However, that's on a cost-by-cost basis, so it depends on the value of your property. It does not include the value of the land, so if you look at your tax bill that you get every year, they have divided the value of your land from the value of your building. So that is how you can determine what that value would be. And a lot of times I've had projects where it's just something as simple as a roof replacement has qualified and they've been able to get tax credits on that. Now you do have to follow the Secretary of the Interior standards, as I said. And if you're not familiar with the standards, it's basically a list of 10 recommendations to follow. In my opinion, and I think for most of us in the office, if you're trying to do a good rehabilitation project, you're going to want to follow the standards regardless. There are things along the line of you repair rather than replace historic materials, such as your windows. If your windows are so far gone that they can't be repaired, you would replace in kind. You always try to preserve the historic character of a building, and you try to preserve those distinctive features. So those are the types of things that the standards speak to. There's also an archaeological component. So depending on the piece of property that you're on, we might do some kind of archaeological study. The important thing to keep in mind is when it comes to tax credits, we are reviewing all the work, both interior and exterior. So it's the entire building. These are some of the, there are some costs that you cannot take a tax credit on, purchasing, marketing, and site work, unfortunately. So if you needed a new driveway or some curbing needed to be fixed, that typically is not allowable. Unfortunately, we do not have money to help you purchase a building, so those would not be included in tax credits. I do have a project actually in Huntington that there is a fountain on the property, and they have clay pipes that connected to the main house. At some point, those clay pipes deteriorated and collapsed. And so the owner of that house wanted to take a tax credit to update the plumbing, and I said that would be considered site work. Well, the fountain was actually listed in the National Register as part of the property, and so she was able to take a tax credit on that work. So always check with us would be my recommendation to make sure that the work that you want to do would be included. So some of the financials that are included, if you need to hire an accountant to help you, you can take a tax credit on their fees. If you need to hire an architect, that's really important because you can take a tax credit on the architect fees, or the consultant if you hire a consultant. And any fees and permits that you might have to, like construction permits, that would also be included. It is, the residential tax credit application does require a physical application to be submitted. It's pretty straightforward, but I do appreciate that I do it every day, so it's a little bit different for us. It's a three-part application process. Part one identifies that you're listed in the National Register and you're eligible for the program. Part two is your scope of work, where you write down all the details of what you plan to do. And then your part three, you submit after all the work is completed. So we like to say part two is your before and part three is after. So you submit photos on each part of the application. If at any point you need to change your scope of work, you can submit an amendment form. And that's pretty typical. We don't normally see construction projects that don't need an amendment form. And again, it is all interior and exterior work. Syndication of credits or the transfer of credits has become something that a lot of people have been talking about. You can actually transfer, if you receive a West Virginia tax credit, you can transfer that to another individual and they would be able to take those credits. It's a little bit confusing, so if you have any questions about syndication of credits, feel free to kind of let me know. But you can enter into an agreement with somebody and they can quote unquote purchase your credits, although the IRS and the Department of Revenue don't like the term purchase. So we also have the Commercial Rehabilitation Tax Credit Program. This is a program that was established by the National Park Service way back in the 80s and has been modified several times since then. We are the managers of the program, so we are your first point of contact on a commercial rehabilitation project. I am the one who will come out and do site visits. If you have any questions about the application process, we are your contacts here in Charleston. Obviously, on the national level, we also partner with the IRS in running this program. So for the federal program, there is a 20% credit on your qualified rehabilitation expenses, and on the state level, there's a 10%. Some of you may have heard in the news recently that there was a push to increase the state level to 25%. Unfortunately, that did not pass the legislature in the last legislative session, so we still are at 10%. There is some language in the governor's budget increasing this to 25%, so we are still monitoring that, but as of right now, our state tax credit is still 10%. So pretty much in order to be eligible for the commercial rehab tax credit, you have to be an income producing property. So that could be either an office, it could be a bed and breakfast, an apartment complex, anything, a hotel, anything that is considered income producing. It also has to be listed in the National Register. There are financial requirements, which we'll talk about. They're a little bit more in depth. And again, you have to follow the standards. As I mentioned, these are the eligibility. This is really important for the nonprofits and the churches. At this point, we have clarified, or the IRS has offered clarification on whether or not non-tax-paying entities can take advantage of this program, and they can. As long as you have a partnership set up with a for-profit entity, you can take tax credits as a nonprofit. So if, say for instance, you are a nonprofit who owns a building that needs rehabilitation work, you can apply for the tax credits and then transfer those credits to your tax-paying entity. And again, that's the syndication process, which has gotten a little bit more complicated, and I can answer questions about. This is the financial requirements. In order to take advantage of the program, you have to spend at least the adjusted gross basis of your property or $5,000, whichever is greater. This is the adjusted gross basis formula. So it's basically the value of your building is basically what we're looking at. So the acquisition cost plus any improvement costs minus the cost of the land. So for instance, if you just bought your building within the last year, but you haven't put any money into it, you would just say what your acquisition cost was minus the value of the land. And again, that is all available. You can find that information out on your tax forms. It has been very unusual for me that a project has not been able to be accomplished because of the financial limitations. For the most part, unless you've really owned your building for 25 years or more and have put a lot of money into it, you should be able to, meet that financial threshold that you have to meet. I think I've been doing this for 5 years, and I think I've had 2 buildings that have not been able to meet that threshold. So most projects should be able to meet that. Again, you have to meet the Secretary of the Interior standards. If you wanted to look at what the standards are, these are the standards for rehabilitation. There are several different quote-unquote standards that the Secretary of the Interior has released, but we follow the Secretary's rehabilitation standards. Again, it is an application process. When we established the residential tax credit program in West Virginia, we copied the federal program exactly. So it's basically the same application process. Everything is pretty much the same. It's just because on the commercial we work with the National Park Service, so you have to submit 2 applications. You have to submit one for us and one for the National Park Service. But it's still a Part 1, which ensures that you are listed in the National Register. The Part 2 is your scope of work, and your Part 3 is your after. So Part 2 is before and Part 3 is after. The application is in the process of being updated, and so we might see some changes coming out probably within the next year. But as of right now, it's a pretty straightforward application process. It just requires, on the commercial, requires a lot of information. So that is something to keep in mind. Again, the transfer or syndication of credits. If you do not have the tax liability in order to take credits, you can find a partner who will work with you and be your, as long as they have a tax liability, they can work with you and take those credits for you. As an example, this is a pure oil station in eastern North Carolina that is owned by a church. And so the church wanted to convert this into their teen room, have a space for their kind of teenage participants to hang out and have a safe place. And so they wanted to do a tax credit on it, but obviously a church doesn't pay taxes. So they found a partner who went in on the project with them, and that partner was able to take the tax credits, and that church was able to rehab their historic structure. So, just because you don't pay taxes does not automatically eliminate you from this program. One of our other programs that is extremely popular is our development grants. And this is a really well-known program here in West Virginia. We're fortunate that we're one of the states that still has funding available for the actual rehabilitation. This is our brick and mortar rehabilitation program. We provide funding to help you basically restore your property. It's an application process. You do have to be listed in the National Register. It's a matching grant, so we pay 50% and you pay 50%. So if you needed to have your roof replaced, we could potentially provide up to 50% of that funding. Now, as I said, it is an application. It is extremely popular, and it's based on priority. So the highest priority is weatherization and stabilization of your historic structure. So that would include if you had a hole in your roof, if you didn't have any windows, if your foundation was failing for some reason, that is the highest priority. The lower priorities is interior work, simply because our goal is to make sure that the building is structurally sound and weatherproof before, kind of getting into more of the interior details. The important thing to keep in mind on this is that it is a reimbursement grant, so we do, you pay the contractor first, and then we will reimburse you for that money. And we'll reimburse you at 50%, as I said. There is a covenant on this program, which we discussed a little bit earlier. If you do receive a grant through our office, we do place a minimal covenant on the building in order to protect it, offer a level of protection. Typically, they run around 5 to 15 years, but it does depend on the level of funding that you receive. The other grant, again, the eligibility, you do have to meet the Secretary of the Interior standards. So I think the two things to take away from today is our office really focuses on the National Register and the Secretary of the Interior standards. There is one other grant that I forgot to include, to be completely honest, is our survey and planning grant. And that's actually the reason behind that is for planning purposes. So what that allows you to do, there are 4 levels in the survey and planning grant that you can apply for. You can apply to have something listed in the National Register. You can apply for an education program. If you, for instance, we're getting ready to do some real estate training workshops where we'll provide training to the real estate agents to help them sell historic structures. That's an education program. We also have money available to allow you to hire an architect or an engineer to do a full study of your building. And that's really important because that can help you with your redevelopment plans. The thought is that you apply for a survey and planning pre-development grant and then turn around and use that information to apply for our development grants at a later date. All of our grants are available on a, typically we only accept applications once a year for both grants, in October for the survey and planning, and in March for the development rehabilitation grants. So keep those dates in mind if you think you have a project that might work. We do recommend, if you wanted to apply for a grant, that you contact Pam Brooks, our grants coordinator. She can make sure that you have the correct application, that you don't have any questions, as it relates to the application. I know that it can be, when you think that you're filling out a grant application, it can be a little overwhelming. They're pretty straightforward, but we do understand that you have questions. So those are 2 sources of funding. The tax credits, both residential and commercial, although they are application-based, we don't have a deadline. So you can submit your application at any point throughout the year, and we'll review it to make sure that you qualify for those tax credits. We also don't, some of you might be familiar with other states that have a quote-unquote cap on their tax credits. We do not have that. So it's not, we don't have a threshold you can apply for as much tax credit as you need right now. So those are kind of the 4 financial programs that we have available to help historic property owners in the state. That actually covers everything that we wanted to talk about. So we'll open it up for questions and see if you guys have any questions specific to your properties or just in general about how our office works.
Thank you. I do have one question that came in, so while everybody's sort of reviewing their notes and thinking up some other great questions, I'll start with this one. How does a city council or other community organization go about establishing an historic landmarks commission? For example, what are the prerequisites, steps to implementation, etc.?
So we did not cover historic landmark commissions. That is a program that we help with historic landmark commissions. A historic landmark commission is essentially established through an ordinance. So whatever the state enabling legislation requirements are is how you would do that. So I think there has to be a reading of 3 times. We have sample ordinances available that we can provide. It's a pretty straightforward ordinance that establishes it. Within West Virginia, our state enabling legislation does not require that you have design review. So a historic landmark commission can be established without design review if that is something you are interested in. And I am also the certified local government coordinator, so if you have any questions specific to your town, I'd be more than happy to talk to you, but it's basically just however you are required to pass an ordinance, it's just a written ordinance. You do have to have a certain makeup of at least 5 members, preferably with some kind of experience. We'd like to have an architect, a lawyer, an engineer, but we also realize that that's not necessarily always possible. And you are required to meet 4 times a year.
Thank you. Can you discuss the process for getting a building listed on the National Registry?
Yeah. Our National Register Coordinator is Jeff Smith. Forgot his name off the top of my head. So basically, there online there's a National Register nomination form available. It requires generally someone with a pretty good experience in history to fill out, and you're going to have to do a lot of research on your property. You want to identify why it's eligible. So, I mean, if it's associated with a famous person, you need to have pretty good documentation of why it's associated with that person, how you have proof that it is, like deed records or whatever. You fill out the nomination form. You send it into our office. We review it. Any edits that our office needs made, because we won't take the nomination into the actual nomination process unless it's complete and we feel that we're going to be successful. We don't want to have it get shot down halfway through because it makes our office look bad. So it might take a while to work through to get the draft into a form, but once we approve it, then it goes into I forget. I'm more familiar with Ohio's.
So once it gets to a certain point in terms of being ready, once you've written your National Register nomination, you've talked with Jeff, and Jeff has reviewed it and made sure it'll kind of pass. It goes to the Archives and History Commission. Our Archives and History Commission meets 3 times a year, and they have to approve all of our National Register nominations. Once it is approved by the Archives and History Commission, there's a couple of public notices that have to go out.
Property owners have to be notified.
Property owners are notified. Certified local governments have the opportunity to comment and participate in that program. And then it gets sent to the National Park Service in their National Register group, and they will pass it. So depending from start to finish, it can take approximately, it can take up to a year to have a property listed. If you're talking about listing a district, it's definitely a year just because there's more detail that needs to go into the nomination than an individual listing. And you're also in a district, you're probably listing, you know, at least 20 buildings. So that's something to keep in mind too.
There's also a difference between listing a district and an individual resource, because to get an individual resource listed, you have to take into consideration the interior of the building as well as the exterior, whereas the district is more about the exteriors of the building.
Is a city hall registered as a historic building? Does that qualify for the grants for improvements?
Yes, it does. We have a number of courthouses and city halls that have taken advantage of the financial resources, as long as it's listed.
Here is a question that may be outside your scope, but this person has some historically significant commercial buildings in the community that have been vacant for decades and are in an extremely unstable condition. Is there a suggestion to achieve demolition as these pose a safety hazard? And they wanted to add that this community has an HLC and a national district that these are in.
We would never want to see an entire commercial district demolished for lots of reasons. And what my recommendation would be is contact our office individually to see how we can help. I can come out and do site visits. Section 106 staff can come out and do site visits. We'll try to help you kind of come up with a plan to, I mean, obviously we don't have developers in pocket who will come out and say, I'm going to save your commercial district, but we'll work with you. The other group that I would recommend you contact is the Preservation Alliance of West Virginia, which is pawv.org. They have a couple of resources that can kind of help kind of shine a light on your community and your needs, and they can also help you know, help you with a redevelopment plan. There's lots of other resources, other organizations throughout the state that can help you, you know, try and help with an economic redevelopment plan. And, you know, you might want to consider some of those. But in terms of wholesale demolition of a historic downtown, that is something that would honestly break all of our hearts. We would never want to see that happen.
We're more interested in helping you mitigate and
avoid that. We'll try to figure out how to help you bring that back instead of taking it out. Because honestly, we have seen communities that demolish buildings in their historic downtown with the expectation that that will create new development opportunities. Rarely does that ever work out. Developers are not really looking to come in and look for a blank slate, especially in smaller communities. They want that feeling of, like we were talking about with the National Register, of, you know, that historic resource that's available only in that community. So that's kind of where we would stand on that.
All right, I have one final question. Are the survey and planning grants also reimbursable at 50%?
Survey and planning grants, the way that our office works is that we receive a portion of our funds through the federal government, and so we hand out some of that money to local governments, and the highest priority is certified local governments. So we also call our survey and planning grants the CLG, or certified local government. So ideally, if you apply for a survey and planning grant, you are a certified local government and have an HLC in your community. Those are reimbursable at 70%. So we would pay 70% and you guys would pay 30%. If you are not a CLG, it would be 60-40. We would pay 60% and you would pay 40%. So a little bit better, actually.
Great. Well, that's the last question. Thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you to all of you for joining us and for your great questions. You see the contact information for these guys is on the screen now, so if you have follow-up questions or more specific questions, I'm sure they'd be happy to take those individually. There will be, the recording for this will be available sometime next week, and I will send an email out with a link to that once it is available, as well as the link to the PowerPoint so that you can have this information at your fingertips. Keep an eye out for our upcoming webinars, and I hope that I'll see you all at the Brownfield Conference in September. Thanks very much.
Thank you.